Welcome to the Botcasters post-talk of the European Chatbot Summit 2024 with David Patariu. David, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today. My name is David Patariu. I'm a privacy law specialist with a law firm in the United States called Venable. Do a lot of work in artificial intelligence, privacy, and cybersecurity. I'm also former Yahoo, Instacart, and Verizon Media, where I worked on the privacy teams and cybersecurity teams there to help those companies stay compliant. And so happy to be here today. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Well, last week, my pleasure. But last week you were one of the speakers at the European Chatbot Summit, and you were discussing the European AI Act and a little bit more. Could you give us, like in 2-3 minutes, the essence of what you gave to the people?
It was such a great event, and it was just happenstance, or we were fortuitous that it actually passed on the day that we were giving that talk, or just the day before. And the other thing I was talking about that day was just conversational AI and the U.S. regulations and the impact for people thinking about taking their European products or services and deploying them in the United States, and what the different considerations may be. And I think it was a mixed bag in the room, in the sense of some people were saying, well, the AI Act is taming the Wild West, and we have the same conversations in the United States. And I was going to say, hey, I am from the Wild West. Let me chime in here. But there's a sheriff in town, right? And this sheriff is the GDPR. And I think we can't lose sight of the core rights that the GDPR grants our end users: access, correction, deletion, portability. And I had these conversations several years ago when people were saying, well, what do we do with our AI systems? Where do we draw the box? Where do the rights end? And, the model is too complex to honor any of these rights. And if you're tech savvy, like we are, myself and yourself, we say, hold on a minute. What about the training set? What about the user input? What about the interaction data? And so, well, what about user rights for that stuff? You can say the model is like a bird's nest, and if you pull, you may not be able to extract a piece of information. But what about the things on either side of it? And let's start there. Let's get some baseline compliance going. And so I think that sheriff in town, it is the Wild West, and we have that same conversation in the United States. Well, there's laws already on the books that prevent bias, or say, hey, you can't discriminate somebody in the employment context. You can't discriminate somebody for housing choices. Well, that all applies to this new technology too. It doesn't just go away because it's a different tech stack. Same thing with the FTC. The FTC is Article 5, right? And it says if you say something and you make certain representations externally, you have to honor that as a company. So that all just doesn't go away just because you're using an AI service or product, or you're using a third-party service. So when people say, well, that's the Wild West, well, there's a lot of stuff there. I think the EU AI Act takes it a step further and makes it clear what people's obligations are. But in the U.S., we still have a lot of regulations that you have to comply with when you're deploying an AI product or service.
Well, that's also probably why self-driving cars are still an issue.
That's right. The same thing. Those rules and regulations about how something is to operate and safety standards and everything else still apply, maybe in a different context, and maybe there needs to be some additions. But generally, companies do have those obligations. As lawyers, we try to help them navigate that landscape. Now, there are new regs that are kind of in the works. With some of these things, like in Connecticut and other states, New York. But generally, and they kind of maybe take things a little further, make things a little clearer, make the obligations for companies more understandable. But at the end of the day, a lot of that stuff is already there. And and certainly the privacy obligations are already there. And that's hard enough for a lot of companies to comply with. You talk about access, deletion, knowing where your data is, purpose limitations, saying, look, if you collect data for fraud prevention, you can't turn around and use that to choose your ad targeting and to enhance your ad targeting profiles. All that stuff is still there. And so companies have to think, okay, well, there is this new piece that we have to deal with, but how do we make sure that we're still complying with what we have to do from 5 years ago? and some companies still struggling to comply with GDPR. Being honest, so in state privacy regulations. So yeah, that was definitely something. Wish I had more time to talk about that during our panel.
But if you zoom out and because what you're saying is actually, if I say I'm not a lawyer, but that responsibility for whatever AI did was already somewhere. So there was a product liability. And what the European AI Act does sort of puts a split on who's responsible for what. Mm. Now, there's one thing in there which is complicated, and I'd like your view on that. Because everybody's talking about training the model, a model, right? And now if you look at product liability, if you start and you haven't trained a model, then the provider of the model is liable for the product. Still depending on what you put in and what you get out, but the input is your responsibility, but what the model does is responsibility of the provider. Now, if you start training the model, and this is according to the European AI, if it becomes specific for you, so if you've trained it with enough of your data, company-specific or product-specific data, then you move from deployer, which is the company that uses it in their processes, to a provider. And all of a sudden, the product liability jumps from OpenAI or Anthropic or one of the other ones, to the company on the other end who just trained the model. And my vision is that, first of all, there's no threshold. Nobody knows where the threshold is. So that's one problem. It's gray. And secondly, I don't think in the boardroom they have any idea that there's a huge uncalculable danger or risk or whatever you want to go, that they call it. It's very hard to mitigate because nobody knows where the red line is. And I don't think they even realized there was a red line.
Yeah, that's right. And you're going to see this kind of stuff. This will just have to be litigated, or you see regulatory actions against certain companies, and that'll help us understand where the line is. And that's very typical in the law. Like, I think the first few years of GDPR is like, well, what do we actually do? Or in the United States, this is a great example. Do not sell, do not share in ad tech. And there were companies that said, hey, look, this doesn't apply to us. And at Yahoo, we said it does. And we took that view that it did. We had to comply, and we had to offer that opt-out. Some companies took a different view, but ultimately it was, enough. The regulators kind of opined on it, and the whole industry moved to say, yeah, you do have to honor do not sell, do not share. But it took a few years for everybody to get there. And it's there's those gray areas when something issues. Well, is it here? Is it there? And I think that's something that's going to be fleshed out. And we talked about that in a panel too. What's ethical? What isn't ethical? What does this have to look like? And that's where the rubber hits the road for privacy professionals and AI professionals, because we have to go based on our prior knowledge of what regulators might do and how they've acted in the past and say, look, okay, well, you're right. There is this gray area, and board members appreciate that there's this gray area on the product liability side between when we train versus when somebody else trains. And we have to buffer against that and educate them on that. Are there going to be a lot of companies that have no idea? Yeah, sure. And that's where there's going to be regulatory action or, some fines or something like that along those lines when people kind of trip over that stuff. But there's a lot of unknowns. And that's why it's going to take a while to get it right.
I understand that. But as professionals in the market, shouldn't we, maybe I put it negatively, but I mean it positively, should we ask the EU people that are busy with this legislation, just give us a threshold to start with? And it might be too strict. That's okay. At least we know where it is. And then we make sure there's no, well, make sure you're never sure, but then we have a stick to try and have no incidents, which is better for everybody, for the PR of using AI and for the companies, no fines to give. And if we see, this is going fine, we maybe can move the threshold a little bit further and give some more space or whatever. But if there's no threshold, it's Russian roulette.
Yeah, that's a problem. I think you do see some regulators doing that. I think my most recent example, and I think that they probably will have to do that. And a lot of these, as people start to dig into this and see what's been passed and try to understand a little better and actually see, well, how does this work for their organization? There's going to be lots of questions like that. I think you see the ICO doing that. They have a consultation series on generative AI, and they're asking for feedback on certain positions, like does legitimate interest cover scraping, online web scraping? And they're trying to feel around, and they're probably going to get a lot of feedback. And we do that in the U.S. too. For example, on COPPA, there's a people write in for proposed rule changes and stuff, and they have a comment period that the FTC has for that kind of thing. And so, I mean, you're right. But it is hard when you don't know where that line is, and to try to give guidance. It would be preferable if things are black and white, but that's the thing with compliance, right? It's like, like you think about real estate or like building a house, and they say, the code says the sidewalk has to be 3 meters wide or 5 feet wide. That's really easy, right? And you're like, oh yeah, sure, I get it. I have to make the sidewalk 5 meters wide. But a lot of times it's like, oh, you need a sidewalk that is accessible. Well, what does accessible mean? And what is that? Well, of sufficient width. What is sufficient width? And so that's where lawyers, that's where we make our bread and butter, is trying to provide reasonable interpretations to people like yourself who are business owners, to say, well, I think this is a defensible position, and it's well reasoned. And I mean, with my clients too, I say, look, if we document this and we document the thinking and stuff, odds are regulators go, at least you were thinking about it. At least you tried to get it right. I think where a lot of companies run into problems is like, you just like, yeah, well, figure it out later, or they just ignore it altogether. And that's what they don't want to see.
So basically, what you're saying, and I recognize this, by the way, but if you have the argumentation or how about what you're doing and why you're doing it this way, and the safeguards or the measures you took to be as safe as possible, and why you think this is a defensible position, then they might disagree with you, the regulators, but at least you have a proper auditable decision process that led to a decision, and it might not be the outcome they would have wished for, and they could tell you, well, we want you to do it differently, but you won't get a fine because you have something that is auditable.
Hopefully it'll be a lesser fine, or I think where you see the big fines is where companies flout the obligations altogether. Like I think I gave one of the examples of my talk was where children's the verified parental consent wasn't collected at all, and the company collected children's data and then used it in a AI model, and then they had disgorgement. And so that's a very extreme example where they say, look, any data you collected and any model you trained based on that data, you have to disgorge it. You have to delete the model. You have to delete the data. And so it's where a company doesn't follow the rules at all, and they don't make any attempt to, I think is where you see most of the regulatory action, a lot of it anyway. And so, the gray area too, but I think that's where you see the really big ones. But it's I think we'll see more of that in the coming months or coming years on this front, and with the GDPR.
Yeah, so maybe I should do another podcast with people from the European Parliament who were involved in the legislation, and just ask them. It's like help us find the threshold, and right. and tell us, because you'd be helping companies that are serious about implementing, but literally have no clue, and our lawyers can't give an answer because they have no clue either.
Yeah,
we don't know.
They're kind of guessing, or they're going on prior precedent and stuff. I think sometimes, though, it's hard for the regulators or the legislators to kind of, they're not sure where it's going to go, and they're trying to give themselves a little wiggle room and give the industry some wiggle room. And so, if they make it super prescriptive and very precise, then, well, if a new technology or new approach to, say, encryption comes along, well, it's not in the statute. You can't use it if it's very prescriptive. If it's more like you have to have reasonable controls or reasonable, well, then there's wiggle room as to what reasonable can be. But to your point, that does make it hard, because then you're like wondering, well, what is reasonable? Is this encryption standard reasonable? And that's where you're relying on third parties, or, what is the standard in the industry? And that's not a good feeling if you're a smaller shop and you don't have the resources to do all that research, it's hard. It is, admittedly.
I just realized something because a while ago we only had these big models, literally the large language models, and now we see coming out the small language models, the SLMs, which is interesting. If you would define a threshold in terms of the amount of data you put in related to the amount of data that was already in there, then with the introduction of an SLM, all of a sudden that changes. And then is that threshold still relevant? So it's a moving target. That's the complicated part in terms of technology. I know they tried really hard to not contain a moving target, but to keep it a target while moving, and keep it moving as well at the same time. But it is hard. But it's something I will ask it because I'm really curious how they see it. And if it's a moving target, how can you give a fine? Because if there's no threshold, you can't say you did it wrong. Then it's about interpretation.
I think the fines. I mean, some of the stuff that I've read about and some of the things, I think they do try to make it very concrete and very specific, and generally, um, and sometimes the fines are generated around like very basic things like failure to honor access requests, failure to, um, some of them are a little more nuanced, um, but generally, what I've seen is that a lot of them are pretty well, they're well reasoned and they're very detailed, especially the Irish TPC and some of the other fines. But and I'm, like I haven't seen one so far, but maybe it's out there that's more nuanced. But I think generally regulators, the ones that I've worked with, they're lenient and they're trying to get it right, and they're trying to help companies understand how to get it right. And
That's a
so,
good thing.
I think it is, and I think it's unique to. I wouldn't say it's unique, but it's definitely a hallmark of the GDPR and the regulators that are kind of trying to help companies understand and get compliant with the GDPR. That they are there is that dialogue back and forth, more so than in other jurisdictions.
And that's just one other thing. I mean, this legislation is not meant to annoy companies. It's to protect the consumer.
That's
And
right.
if you keep that as a company, if you keep in mind that in your reasoning, now this is the way we protect the consumer, and that's your starting point and your end point, then a regulator is probably okay. I understand you took this approach. There's different. I see it in a different way, but you did what you had to do.
Yeah.
So change it to this, and we're fine. Not
Right.
a fine, but we're fine. Um,
Well,
I would assume.
you hope so. Like I said, I was on a panel in January, and there, like you never get a gold star, but yeah, you can get fined. Like, and that's the thing. A lot of times, it is a possibility. But again, if you have a good privacy team and good lawyers working with you, and you're trying to get it right, and you have your documentation there, that's it's a good way to conduct yourself in a way that it gives you some protections against getting afoul of what a regulator expects.
That makes sense. And what was your uptake on the whole event? I mean, of course, we sat down at the dinner
Hmm.
and had a lot of fun there.
Hmm.
Um, but if you zoom out, you met all these different people with different backgrounds. What is as an American? It was a European event, of course, but you were there as an American, and Americans have different ways of making events. It's a little bit bigger. But how do you view the intensity and the content of the event in the sense that the depth of the knowledge that was shared?
It was very deep. It was, I think Sydney did a tremendous job putting that together, and as I had not attended before, and I think going there, and I attend a lot of conferences and events and have for many years, and so it was refreshing to see that level of content, and like when people were talking about prompts and showing their prompts and showing how their demonstrations and things you don't usually see. It was a very collaborative community, very positive, like good energy in the room. A lot of different ideas, people thinking, okay, we want to get this right on the privacy side, we want to get this right ethics on the ethics side, and we want to get the new EU AI Act. We want to make sure we're compliant with that. I saw a lot of, and then I guess the other thing is just the people really paying attention in the room. sometimes you attend a conference and everyone's on their laptops typing or, their phones. People are really paying attention, and the questions showed that during the conference. The other thing too, I do a lot of work in the U.S. with conversational AI, and it was good to be amongst my friends, and say, because kind of sometimes as a lawyer you work in a silo, and you're like, is anyone else working on this? Like, my clients have these questions, but who else is doing this? And it was great to see such a gathering. It was like almost 1,000 people at the event, and then all the vendors. The vendor space was excellent, and a good dynamic there. People stayed till the very end. A lot of people will cut out during the last one or two talks. It was packed until the very, very end, and which is unusual on a Thursday afternoon and stuff. And despite the rain and everything else, everybody came out. People were there at 8:30 in the morning at the meet and greet beforehand. And the dinner was really great too. The speaker dinner, the haggis and the bagpipes and the whole. I mean, it just was a real sense of community at this event. So.
It's interesting that you should say that, because the level of sharing knowledge, and I'm in that space too. It's really weird. I haven't experienced anything like it in any other field I worked in. That people are willing to share their knowledge, their experience, even though they attained it by really hard work and trial and error. No. Why shouldn't I share? Why shouldn't I help you? It's a new field, and it's a lot is going to happen with conversation with the generative AI being implemented in the field, there's this honest sense of wanting to do it right or wanting to do the right thing, and that's why, which I found unusual, the amount of attention for the European AI Act in a convention like that is. I found that astonishing, in a positive sense, because it was also looked at from different angles. So what that did is a lot of people start to realize and go home. It's like, darn, we need to get moving. Now we're still ahead of it and can do the right thing before we create trouble for our companies or in our work. And I think that's a good thing, because eventually we'll get compliance with the European AI Act by design. And that's what you preferably want. If you design a new company now, you would make it GDPR compliant by design, right? And
100% right. I mean, to your point, the people in the room, they cared. They wanted to get it right. They were there. And I think it's good to be in that environment and good to have that level of collaboration. I think Christoph did a great job emceeing or kind of bringing a lot of very good insights to the group about customer service and how you want to treat a customer. There was that level too, right? It was more than just the technology. It's like, look, this has to work for your customers. You need to. I think one of the takeaways I'll repeat it here that he mentioned. You have to know when to use this technology and when not to. I think one of his examples was, if you have somebody who's calling you to book a flight because a relative just died, probably not the time to use a chatbot, and probably a time to switch them over to a real person to help them get through that issue and get their flight booked so that they can honor their relative that passed away. And I think it's those kind of insights, and it's like, yeah, that's right. We know that, but it's good to hear and internalize. And so that's stuff that you don't usually get or see on, like a webinar or something like that. Well, we hear it here because we were at the conference, but that made it a very personal touch too. And it kind of makes you realize how this is a different kind of technology. There's a lot of, it really is personal. You're interacting with your end users, and you see the people there that were like, they're sensitive to that too, which is great.
It's interesting that you should mention that, because of course there's this trend or thought in a lot of people's mind, AI is going to replace a lot of jobs. First of all, it's going to create a lot of new jobs. That's one thing. But there's this notion that, if we have AI, we can maybe kick out a lot of people. And they don't realize that if you start with AI, that you first need to do a lot of work in order to get at a level where you actually have that productivity rise, or you'll be able to replace work of people with AI. But my point is, if you release those people from your company, you also lose the knowledge to book that flight with empathy for that person who just lost someone. So the what Christoph said, I thought it was really in the heart, saying, yeah, but technology does not replace the emotional part of the empathy part of people. You can sense emotions, but it's not the same. So that was important. And that brings me to another question for you. Is your work going to change as a lawyer by generative AI?
To some extent. I mean, getting back to the some of the takeaways from the conference, just one other really quick thing was, some people saying, well, it can take the emotion out of things too. I don't remember Christoph's example where he was talking about looking at multiple emails and saying, look, you might get some very angry customers, and they may say some very nasty things to you. And you can actually have AI remove the nastiness and just say, this customer wants a refund, this customer wants this, and enable a group to process, because that takes a wear and tear on the customer service agents that are reading all those emails. But if you can make them neutral using an agent, that helps them process them more quickly because they don't take it to heart. I think that was a great use. When I was in medical school 20 years ago, we talked about assistive technologies and for medicine. And I think medicine, getting back to your question about, well, is this going to cause a lot of people to lose their jobs? And so I think in medicine, they kind of came to the conclusion that, look, it's assistive. It may help you remember something you might forget, may help you look at a diagnosis a little different, may help you process something. But at the end of the day, a person needs to be there to make the decision. Do we operate? Do we not operate? What drug should we dispense? What drug don't we dispense? And it's funny, I was at InfoSec World, and I got that same question. And there was somebody in the medtech field, and I was like, has it changed in 20 years? Like, no, we still believe that it's assistive. It's not replacing a doctor. It's not replacing a nurse or a clinician. And so I think people are going to come to that realization too, that maybe it's a productivity enhancer. It's helping you remember things that you might have otherwise forgotten. It's helping you maybe do your job a little bit better, but it's not going to replace people. And just one other point about, you mentioned about when companies get rid of a lot of people and stuff, there's a brain drain. And I agree. Having worked in tech companies, a lot of stuff isn't documented. And the idea that any company is going to come along and go, oh, we're going to use AI now, we're going to get rid of 50% of our workforce. I'm like, you're going to lobotomize your company. And so, and that's
med school, right?
Yeah, right. Because the thing is, a lot of the knowledge, you have people that have been there 5 or 10 years, they know who to talk to, where to go, what systems work a certain way, what systems don't work a certain way. A lot of that is documented. You can't just plug in another person and make that work. And I think that's true in the legal side as well. Now, to bring it back to your first question, a good lawyer is hard to find, first of all. Secondly, a lawyer that understands your business and what you're trying to do and appreciates the technology, that's pretty rare as well. I think that some of this technology will help lawyers maybe do a little better job proofing or checking their work or doing legal research. I think Westlaw has a fabulous precision technology that kind of summarize legal research. That's very impressive. They have contract review software that will look for certain terms and save clients a lot of money. And so I've seen, our firm uses them actually, some of those technologies to save our clients money and to make our work more efficient. But is it going to replace lawyers or replace doctors? I don't think so in the near term, maybe 100 years from now or something like that. But I think there's still a place for both the person and the technology to sit side by side and be more productive.
Probably with one nuance, if I may add that for the doctor or the lawyer that doesn't know how to use it or doesn't know how to be assisted by it, might be in trouble because, and that's another thing in the lawyer world. If done in the right way, and there's a independent company supplying this kind of software and it's affordable, you create a really interesting level playing field between the big companies and the small law firms. And you might have the big law firms getting into trouble because of their cost base, and small law firms being more productive and efficient and faster, and maybe more affordable because they use these kind of systems. So you can handle more clients. So for you, in the end, it doesn't make a difference, but for your clients, it does. Their bill might go down.
That's right. I mean, you think about it and you say, well, maybe in the case we call it flexing, right? Or in consulting, we call it flexing, right? And it's like, the ability to add more people to a matter if you have to look at a lot of stuff at the same time. And so for a smaller group, or maybe a group that's doesn't maybe just don't have the staff, you may not need to flex the same way, because you can use this assistive technology to review a lot of documents and pull out the piece of information you need. Whereas in the past, in the 80s, you would need boxes of documents and 10 lawyers sitting there page by page looking through it to find the key phrase that you're looking for in 100,000 pages of documents. Whereas now maybe you could use the technology that would look through it and say, okay, summarize each document and tell you where the phrase or the clause that you're looking for exists. So,
you know what I just realized? That what if not the lawyers start using it, or maybe they do, but what if the judges start using it? Because they get the same, they get double the paperwork. So they get the paperwork from from the litigators who attack and the others who defend. So why wouldn't they use it?
So they are, yeah. They actually met with Westlaw about a month ago, and they had a product for judges to review briefs and to see if the case law was being used in the right way within a brief.
Oh, wow.
And they made this product for judges. And then they said to the judges, I don't know how many, they were like, hey, can we release this to the lawyers? And we'd love for you to release this to the lawyers. We're tired of seeing crappy law in their briefs. Yeah, so there's that tech does exist. Now, you usually, unfortunately, hear about the people that will take the off-the-shelf version of ChatGPT 4.0, and they're like, oh, generate a brief for me, and it'll generate case law.
Like this one lawyer that had cases in there that didn't exist.
There's 3 or 4 cases like this now.
Oh, wow.
And so, and you're like, well, that's an example of somebody who doesn't understand generative technology, right? And I talk about this too when I give talks. It's like, hey, look, when a user asks, what is your privacy policy? I don't want my AI to generate that on the fly. I wanted to give it, this is the privacy policy for the product. This is the terms of use. And the same thing, if I'm a lawyer and I'm sitting there and I say, hey, give me a brief, I don't want it to generate case law. And that's why you need to use the tool that's designed to not generate the case law, but give you the complete picture or summaries. And that's like Westlaw. I'm sure the other Lexis has similar tech as well. But yeah, that's your point earlier. It's like, yeah, you got to know how to use this stuff. It's like a car. If you put a 4-year-old in a car, they'll run it into the wall. If you put somebody that, has taken the time to understand, and lawyers are obligated actually under the rules of professional responsibility in the United States. I'm sure the EU and other jurisdictions have the same thing, to understand and to use in the right way the technology that is available to them. And there's a case where a lawyer used Dropbox or something, and other people got access to the document. And it was brought in for a violation of the rules of professional responsibility, because you can't just use a tech and then just have it freely open for anyone to pull documents out of that share. And this is the same thing, where you do have responsibilities as a legal professional to understand the tech you're using and to use it the right way so that your clients' interests aren't harmed.
Well, thank you, David. And I think AI is going to not always going to make it easier, but at least it's going to make it a lot more exciting.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And I'm looking forward. We're going to eventually going to record another podcast on another subject, so I'm looking forward to that. And thank you very much for this short podcast and sharing your knowledge and your insights. And looking forward to meeting again.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone out there watching, and have a great week. And look forward to speaking again on an AI or other topic of your choice.
Thank you.
Thank you.